We are a tiny bit delirious because we have been joined with an author that is taking the world by storm, a genuine word of mouth bestseller. Tomorrow times 3.
I feel a bit embarrassed because mine's so battered.
Yeah. I will say one thing before Sophie introduces the book, but of course, before we begin, thank you, Gabrielle, for your time.
Thank you for having me. This is cool.
Please don't like us.
I have a bone to pick with you.
Okay, please.
I feel like the experience of reading this book was similar to when I was taken to watch the film Up, because you're kind of brought into this wonderful world and you're relaxed. And then you ripped my heart out and I wanted to sit shiver. I should say there will be a number of Jewish cultural references because we're a mixed family, okay? As my buffer would say, this is mishpacha. But I was ready to cover the mirrors. Like, this was not funny. But it did break my heart and make my heart. Please continue.
So I shall just give a brief synopsis. I mean, it's essentially, this is the story primarily of, oh God, is it 3 or 4? Because there's Dov. I mean, I can't. Sadie and Sammy.
Dov!
Let's start. Yeah, Dov, that's enough. But Sadie and Sammy, let's begin. They meet in the kind of social activity room of a children's hospital. They're there for different reasons. Sadie's there because her sister is unwell. Sammy is there because he has survived a car crash. And they strike up a friendship. And ultimately, that is the seed that germinates. And we see how their lives intertwine together and separate, come back. I'm not going to say too much throughout the course of this novel, with some other incredible characters who are just so real. I feel a bit bereft without them. And the lives that they lead together, really. It's a book about relationships. It's also a book about gaming, which we will come to. But I guess this leads to the first question. These characters are so unbelievably real, Gabrielle. I mean, I felt that I still feel like I know them and I still think about them. And I finished this book several weeks ago. Did you start when you came to this book? I know you said this is your 10th novel. Wow.
I feel very
inadequate.
Yes.
Inadequate would be the word. Did this novel come to you? Was there a character's voice that came to you that started the writing process, or did you have this idea? How did it work? Because it's just so vast, but yet you cover so much detail as well.
You know, it's funny. I think that writers are encouraged to tell stories about the process, and the stories make everything seem like it's much tidier. But in fact, like, the book itself is about, how messy the creative process is, how you go to an art exhibit and you're inspired by something you see there, or your friend tells you about a movie, and then that and all of these things kind of together become art in a way, and so I think the key to being an artist or a writer in the world is to live in the world as much as you can and keep your eyes open as much as you can. That said, this started with a tiny idea about video games. And I was thinking to myself how, the first generation of people to play video games as children were born in the late 70s and early 1980s. In the US, we call that the Oregon Trail generation. It's in between old, young Gen X or old millennial, something like that. And I just started to think, how does playing video games your whole life affect the way you experience other relationships, the way you experience mortality and all of that? And then I kind of I have ideas all the time, but you never really know what's going to attract enough other ideas and people, i.e. characters, to them. So with regard to the characters, I think when I started out writing novels, you kind of have maybe one character, that's you. Basically, as you go on, you realize that the kind of key to writing characters is you have to know yourself, know your kind of prejudices and your privileges. And every character you write is some distance from you, so it's not you, it's these little incremental distances. Anyway, so, I didn't really have a novel until I had Sam and Sadie. And I say that Sam was born maybe 1 second before Sadie because he had a name before Sadie had a name, So I had these two characters in the train station. And, that was the beginning. And you just really don't know. This was a novel that like I quit writing a couple of times, sometimes because I needed to go research. I mean, like, and then I came back to it. I kept wanting to, kind of like a game that you play, I kept wanting to just like solve the puzzle of this novel. I was like, and I remember I had been working on this novel on and off for like 3 years, and then the pandemic started. And I was like, if it didn't seem necessarily like what would, we don't remember now, even now that it's only like 2 or 3 years ago, we don't really remember this, but like we had no idea what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Like really, like would everybody die? Like we really didn't know. And I felt that like if there was no publishing at the other end, if there was never another book published by me or anyone else, I just thought, I wanted to solve this story for myself. I wanted to like have done this, and so I remember that feeling. And so I guess I don't remember what the question was, so I've given a rambling answer. So I'll just add a period now. Period.
No, but you did answer it.
You did, and thank goodness you came back to it to solve.
Oh my God,
to finish your game, essentially.
Essentially, I mean that's what books are like. People don't realize it. The ways in which you just kind of go back to the thing over and over and over again. Maybe most tasks in life are like that, the kind of, I guess repetitious nature of anything that you do, and then the only way you kind of get better at things is through repetition,
Absolutely. Going back to your point about the characters having incremental distances between yourself, what struck me, and there's so many things to talk about, and I should say I'm a total non-gamer, and what struck me was the creativity, and it's almost like there's this perception of gaming to be childish and moronic, and you're wasting your time, you're wasting your life. And then, you bring in Shakespeare, you bring in all of these different elements, and it was so beautiful. But the thing that I think resonated with me most of all was the diversity of the characters' backgrounds and how that influenced how they behaved. And, you had the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and you had question of how do we deal in this new country, right? And like we're trying to find our way. How much of your own experience did you bring within this book?
Well, it's funny, when I started writing novels, I think I saw fiction as a mask I could wear, so every character I ever wrote was as different from me as possible, literally like blonde haired, blue eyed people, so that there was no possibility that anybody would mistake that person for me. And I think that was a thing I did almost, to be like a life preserver, to just some kind of safety measure, a seatbelt, and then over the years, I could just feel the mask like slip off. And by the time I got to this book, I realized, that somebody like me, so I should say I'm half Jewish and half Korean, and so and that somebody like me might be at the center of a narrative, maybe because of some of even the discussions around appropriation, all that was kind of like in my head at that time, thinking about the cultures that we are privileged to be a part of, and maybe then give us like some kind of particular insight into writing about them, that you are only given in the world we live in now. And I'm not actually making a judgment about what this is right or wrong. You're only given so many identities, even though we also all have many identities. And I think that's something like that I think the book speaks to, so, when I speak of distances from myself, everybody is a discrete distance from me in this book, like Sam has exactly my background, but I don't have his experience with, disability in that sense, Sadie, has half of my background, but also I have many of her experiences as a woman in the arts, so much of that is drawn from, my own career, and then I had worked in Japan for a while. So in fact, people forget that Marx is actually half Korean and half Japanese. And so a thing that fascinated me when I have gone to Japan, and particularly Japan, is the way in which there's kind of a prejudice against other Asians that are not Japanese in Japan.
Really?
And it's something you don't really think about, in that sense, and especially, and also some of like the experiences of wondering what it would be like if you lived somewhere where everybody around you was Asian. Like the town I grew up in was Boca Raton, Florida, where I went to high school, and that is 66% Jewish. And I remember when I went out into the world, I was like, wow, the world is significantly less Jewish than I thought it was.
We live in Northwest London. I'm just going to tell you.
It was rare to meet anybody. So then I went to Harvard, which actually has a pretty good Jewish population. I'm like, but wow, there are a lot less Jewish people here than in the world, than in the world that was Florida. And so I was just thinking to myself, like, how much my identity shifts all the time based on like where I am, you know what I mean? And Sam speaks about it, about like how when he's in Koreatown, he feels both more Korean and less Korean. He feels more Korean because like he is around Korean people and all these Korean things, but he also feels less so because he's aware that he is not Korean in the way that they are, and I think, so I experiencing that strongly as a biracial person, but I think everybody experiences that in some way, to some degree as well, and I think sometimes around the discussions with identity, which I have to say I found very useful in terms of thinking about my own work. But sometimes what's lost is all the nuance, I think, in the way people actually experience identity and race,
I mean,
I could listen to that all day. I'm just going to put that.
I think we have to talk about gaming. Okay, so what's interesting, I guess. Are
you going to come out?
No, I used to game like as a child, and I remember stumbling upon like in AOL chat. There was like whole like gaming rooms. This is like way back. There was I mean I don't know if you ever did this games on AOL, and then there were other games that I played, and I often gamed like when I actually associate it now, particularly when I had like maybe more challenging times at school. I felt that gaming was a way to kind of just be myself and do something that I enjoyed and sort of take away like anything else. And so I did game. I haven't for a while, but I bet I'd be really good at it. However, the thing is, I think this book, you don't have to have been a gamer to get this book.
God, no.
Like, I think it's a book about relationships. As I mentioned to you before, I pushed this book at my mum and said, please make your book club read this book. Now, I'm pretty sure none of them are gamers.
Right.
And I think initially there may have been a bit of, oh, really? And then my push again, read this book. And they are, from what I understand, absolutely loving it. One has come back and said, this is 10 out of 10. And she never gives a 10, apparently. So my point is, gaming is not essential for people to have been involved in. But how important was it for you as a writer putting that in? And you mentioned before that obviously you wanted to write a book about it. So can you tell us a bit more about why?
Right. So I just want to say, like, thinking about gaming, gaming really is another form of storytelling, and it can be understood as kind of something that is like the marriage of storytelling, art, and technology. And I think, even people that say that they don't, that's like a triple marriage, by the way. That's some kind of plural.
I love it, but you're right.
You should patent that. Patent it.
But the funny thing about it is, I think, I'll talk to people who are like, I don't game. And they say it really sternly. And then I think, but you do game, because everybody plays something. They play maybe they've played Wordle, which is actually incredibly romantic because that guy made it for his wife or whatever.
I know. Still play it every day.
Our husbands are not
You do a crossword puzzle, or maybe you play cards, or maybe all you do is use Instagram and Facebook. And that is a game in and of itself. It's one where you kind of, the currency of cards, and so it engages in the same way a game does. For me, so for my prior 9 books, there isn't a single interview with me that I mentioned gaming, and there isn't a single like reference to gaming in any of those books. And I think that's because I never saw like gamer or gaming as an interesting thing about me. It was something I did for 30 years or so or even more, 35 years, 40 years, like a really long time without ever actually thinking this was an interesting thing. For me, I gamed starting from when My dad is a computer programmer, and he has a background much like Sam's, like a math major that decided he wanted to go into computer programming basically because he got tired of academia. And, he worked in software development. So I had a lot of this knowledge. My dad would have loved for me to have gone into the family business, which was, computers. But of course I was like, no, I don't want to do that. That's for you. So this kind of, but I was adjacent to it and knew a bit about computer programming and how software gets made and all that just because of my, dad did that for his whole career. And my mom also worked in computers. So that's where some of that stuff came from. And I think gaming, but I never would have, again, put gaming or gamer as a thing about myself. I didn't think about it like reading. I always tell people I never gamed with an ulterior motive, i.e., like in the way you can read sometimes, you want to read that because you want to become a more rounded reader, what have you. I only gamed because something amused me, so it was very pure until such time as I started researching this book, when I had to like kind of game beyond just what entertained me to understand some of other kinds of games, so that was sort of my connection to it. I think more people have connections to gaming than they know. And I also think what's really sad, and it kind of touches on something you were saying before, it's that people kind of reach a certain point in their lives as adults where they're like, playtime is over, I will never play again. And yet play is incredibly healthy. Play, like I think humans are actually naturally very playful. We like puns, we like, we like all of the ways in which you can kind of, and the reason we play, I think, is because we are trying to connect in a way that doesn't require so much, I think, labor. And so play is incredibly healthy. I believe in play completely. And I think that's another thing with the book. My mom's book club, by the way, some of them did not like the book.
Can you imagine?
They were kind of like, sad. My mom was kind of sad about it. And I was like, but they're in their 70s. So that, but anyway, it's not to say no one in their 70s has liked the book. Many of them have, but they were just like, I'm not a gamer. But I feel like once you say that about yourself at the head, that just gives you a resistance to the subject where you sort of never.
It made me want to game again. It made me want to game again.
But it made me want to game. And I must tell you that I was profoundly brought up with the concept of like, it's wasting your time. And the one article that changed my entire perspective, which this book made me think about so much, was that paraplegic guy who was gaming for 18, 20 hours a day, and his family would constantly beg him to come upstairs, and he was just there, and then he died, and then hundreds of people turned up to his funeral. I don't know if you ever read about this. And, he had this entire life played out. And what struck me about Tomorrow Times 3 is that you extrapolate the creative design that goes into gaming, but also the sociological, the philosophy, the psychology that goes into gaming, and how it's almost a mirror of the emotions and the journeys of the people that are either playing them or created them. But I wanted to ask you, like, how did you balance the amount of detail that went into this book about the game with the relationships? Because it felt very tunely balanced. It didn't feel oversaturated.
I think if I have no secrets about writing. At this point, I think I've written books so many different ways that I know nothing definitely works every time. And I am actually comfortable with the notion that you can get to the end of something and people will not respond to it in the way that you hoped. It's delightful when they respond to it in the way that you do hope, But for me, the only way I can, in terms of achieving balance, I knew that every game came out of people's particular life, their background, their life story, what was happening. And then also adding to that, what was technologically available and what they had the ability to make at that time. So it was kind of balancing these two poles. And then I spent a lot of time studying, like, what were the top 10 games of that year? What kind of things did people play? What did they like? And again, because there were easy visuals for all of this, it was interesting how they kind of kept feeding each other, but I will say, so for instance, when I was coming up with Solution at the beginning, which is the game Sadie makes about her grandmother,
oh my God.
So much of that was knowing how much, when I was a kid, as I said, growing up in Boca Raton, Florida, the town was probably, as I said, 66% Jewish or something like that, And so when in any case, we had really like large survivor days where there would be like a lot of people that would come. And it occurred to me as like I had gotten older that there were fewer and fewer survivors because of just time, and that made me sad. But in a sense, the time I would feel the most Jewish, because my mother is the Gentile, which means by most Jewish standards, I am not Jewish. But the time I would feel the most Jewish, and it's really weird, is when I was thinking about the Holocaust, because you only needed to have one Jewish grandparent to, end up in a concentration camp, and so there were times when that was the way I kind of connected the most to being a Jewish person. And so thinking about all those things is kind of like knowing how much, especially as a young person, the Holocaust loomed in my life. It was easy to imagine the kind of game like Sadie might make,
Right.
which is obviously solution is quite transgressive, et cetera. But it also is about the mechanics of the time, the game mechanics, which is to say, like, she knows that Dove likes Tetris. So it's kind of a Tetris-based game that involves like putting blocks together, So all these kinds of things that like fed into each other to make any particular game. In terms of the overall balance, something I've always done and try to do is I read all of my work on a particular, this book was largely written beginning to end minus one section, which I wrote at the end. But I will read everything I've written up till the point that I'm starting, because I actually like to be exactly the place where the reader is going to be when I start writing for that day. And it gets really difficult to do that, because when your book like starts to approach like the 500 page mark, you're like, I cannot read 400 pages before I start today. So you then like kind of like, I'll just read the like last 100 or something, but I really, really like to have a sense of how the thing paces from beginning to end. So I think that helps a little bit with achieving that kind of balance.
Fascinating.
I mean,
I don't know what to say.
no, I feel very like just privileged to speak to you about this today. Honestly, as I said to you before we came online, but I think I've said it already, that we just absolutely adored this book. And I have to ask, I know you've written 9 before, and you've also said that, you've written books in all sorts of different ways. That there's not like a definitely right way and presumably not a definitely wrong way. How have you found the reaction to this one? And did you expect it in any way when you finished it, when it was done? Did you kind of feel this is really, really amazing?
What book did we say?
Not A Little Life.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't make favorites, but I do prefer this, but that's for another conversation. But did you see this coming?
I'll tell you, I got to the end of the book, and what I felt and what I said to my partner was, I don't care how it does, because I feel completely at peace that I have done everything I could do. I felt for the first time just that everything I had ever learned about writing, I had been able to apply. We talked about it a little bit before we got on, about the kind of like, for a long time as a writer, there is a distance between your abilities and your taste, and so for me, I was always really aware of that, probably because I'm naturally a self-conscious person, so like I was always aware of that, which isn't to say I was quite fortunate. I had, of my 10 books, I would say like 2 of them were really good bestsellers, and one of them was okay, and then the rest of them really didn't do that well, and so, but I had enough things that did really well that I haven't had to do anything but write for a really long time, which is great. And so I'm not trying to say, and there are people still who like some of those prior books so well that they don't even understand like what this book is. It's like they're like, I don't get it. And I kind of knew that too, that I would lose some people when I wrote it. And I also, with all due respect to those people and how grateful I am that they supported my work, and I'm not even saying all that work is bad, you have to not care about losing readers, to kind of to keep moving forward and progressing. I think there are ways in which all artistic industries, but particularly publishing, want you to, like, once you figure out how to do a thing, they just want you to keep making that same thing. But for me, and I think that's fine. I understand people who like to read that way, like they want to read in this, like to have press that same button over and over again. But for me as an artist and a person, that's not the journey I'm on. Like I am Sadie in that sense. As soon as I have done something, I wish to do something else, but I felt really at peace. I felt the usual like neurotic stress one feels leading up to publication, but really at peace with the work I had done. And in a way, like that makes all the it makes like when like an amazing thing happens, I feel that a little bit less than you would think. And when something horrible happens, which there hasn't been that much, but when somebody say has a bad reaction or a negative review or something, I feel that less as well, because I know I did the thing I exactly meant to do, you know.
That's incredibly special. I know that we've about 15 more questions, but I do have one more. Because first of all, you just blow my mind, because I don't think I ever saw literature as art until you brought in so many different elements to this book, that I really began to understand that it is storytelling is art. You know, you don't see it in the same medium as painting or design, but it truly is. But you also deal with some incredibly difficult topics, which we have touched upon. So childhood illness, disability, racism, misogyny, violence within a relationship. And I wondered, obviously you come from a biracial background, but did you have any other sensitivity readers, or was there anything that you were worried about writing and took time over to consider, just because you deal with it so tenderly and so beautifully, that it felt just fluid?
You know, in terms of, you know, thinking about, it's funny, we get into a kind of place where I think that we are afraid to write other kinds of people. We are afraid maybe to write big things happening. I think we are very worried about that, which is triggering. You know, but for me, I'm not a person who's particularly easily triggered, let me say that. But also, I think like books are meant to be. You know, they're meant to be. And so for me, over the years, I've kind of had to make a decision. I think most writers make this decision, whether you're going to write books that live in the world as it is, you know, or books that, you know, kind of close their eyes, you know. So you'll read a book, say, and I'm not saying I don't understand this, that they'll write a book that's contemporary and they'll say like, well, the pandemic didn't happen, you know, but for example, you know, that kind of thing. And I don't have to deal with that in this book, but that's what I mean in a sense. I live in the world and the world affects me. So in terms of like wanting to write about gun violence, or in terms of wanting to write about disability, or, you know, issues around class and race and all of those things, I feel like the thing I can do, so a sensitivity reader is great. And sometimes I have employed them, but I think for this one, not as much, because what I have found is that the best thing, the problem with any given sensitivity reader is that they are limited by their own particular lens and experiences as well. So then to say as if one person can speak for all, say, disabled people, they can speak generally for one. So what I have found, as opposed to like leaning on somebody else and saying, I expect you to do my work for me, I have decided to more actively just decide, and I mentioned this before, to really acknowledge my privilege when I write another character. And I don't know if that's a word that even occurred to me ever when I started as a writer, to really acknowledge, again, the big space between Sam and myself, and to think about all the ways in which my life is easier because I am not exactly Sam, you know. And also, you know, the internet is a great tool for being able to find many things, but one of the things is many first person accounts of exactly, you know, anything you wish to know about, from, you know, what is a, you know, successful game designer in their 40s like, to, you know, what is the experience of having an amputation like. You know, there's a wealth of things you can read, and so many accounts of every single thing. And so I found that's what I did. But the most important, I think, sensitivity reader, and I don't mean this to sound arrogant in any way, it's really been myself, and keeping my eyes even more open to the experiences of others as a writer, you know, because again, that one sensitivity reader is one person with a particular set of experiences that isn't necessarily useful for the book that I have at hand, you know. So that's kind of been my evolving thinking. I know that's not where we're necessarily, where everyone has landed in publishing, but it's where I've landed. I have to take responsibility for my book, you know what I mean, in the end. And the mistakes I made and the limitations of my eye, you know, which I don't deny are there.
Amazing. I don't want this to end. I've told everybody who I've forced this book onto, who all loved it, that I'm speaking to you today. And this has just been amazing. Thank you so much for making the time, Gabrielle. I mean, really, it's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was really, really fun.